The lantern flame flickered in Samuel Lancaster's hand as he pushed open the heavy barn door that October evening in 1878, expecting nothing more than the familiar scent of hay and the soft sounds of his two horses settling in for the night. What he found instead made him freeze in his tracks. A pair of frightened eyes staring down at him from the hayloft, and a woman's trembling voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Please don't hurt me." Samuel raised the lantern higher, his other hand instinctively moving away from the revolver at his hip to show he meant no harm. The light revealed a young woman huddled in the corner of his hayloft, her dark hair tangled with pieces of straw, her dress torn and dirty, and her face streaked with what looked like days of dust and tears. "Madam, I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said, keeping his voice low and steady. "But I'd sure like to know why you're hiding in my barn." The woman's shoulders sagged with what might have been relief, though fear still lingered in her eyes. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of better days before whatever circumstances had brought her to his property outside Abiquiu, New Mexico territory. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, and those 6 words carried the weight of desperation that Samuel recognized from his own past. He set the lantern on a wooden post and held up both hands. "All right. Why don't you come down from there and we can talk about this properly?" "When did you last eat?" The woman's hesitation was palpable, but after a long moment she began to climb down the ladder. Samuel kept his distance, not wanting to spook her further. When she reached the ground, he could see she was trembling, whether from cold or fear or both, he could not tell. "My name is Samuel Lancaster. This is my ranch about 3 miles outside of Abiquiu. Who are you?" "Florence Davison," she said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I arrived in town 4 days ago on the stage from Santa Fe. I was supposed to meet someone, but he never came." Samuel studied her face in the lantern light. She had the look of an educated woman, not someone who belonged sleeping in barns. "Who were you supposed to meet?" Florence's jaw tightened. "A man named Robert Coleman. We were engaged to be married. I left everything in Missouri to come west and be his wife. When I arrived, I learned he had married someone else 2 months ago, a woman with a substantial dowry." The bitterness in her voice was understandable, and Samuel felt a surge of anger toward this Robert Coleman. "That's a low thing to do to anyone, but why are you in my barn instead of finding proper lodging in town?" "Because I spent nearly everything I had on the journey west," Florence said, her voice breaking slightly. "I had enough for 2 nights at the boarding house, but that money ran out yesterday. Mrs. Henderson, who runs the place, felt sorry for me and let me stay an extra night, but she has her own livelihood to consider. I tried to find work, but every establishment I approached either had no positions available or made it clear they wanted nothing to do with a woman in my circumstances." Samuel could imagine the gossip that must have spread through Abiquiu once Florence's situation became known. Small towns could be cruel to those they perceived as outsiders or somehow scandalous, even when the scandal was not of the person's own making. "So you walked out here?" Samuel asked. "I remembered seeing your ranch when the stage brought me into town. I thought perhaps I could sleep in your barn for a night or 2 until I figured out what to do next. I'm sorry for trespassing on your property, Mr. Lancaster. I truly am." Samuel rubbed his jaw, considering the situation. He was 30 years old, had been running this ranch alone for the past 3 years since his younger brother had died of fever, and had grown accustomed to solitude. Taking in a strange woman, even temporarily, would certainly cause talk. But he could not in good conscience turn her out into the cold October night. "Come up to the house," he said finally. "You look half-starved and it's getting colder. We can figure out the rest in the morning." Florence's eyes widened. "Mr. Lancaster, I could not possibly impose on you like that. If you would just allow me to stay in the barn for another night or two, I promise I will find a solution and be gone." "Miss Davison, I'm not letting you sleep in my barn like some kind of stray cat. I have a spare room in the house. You can stay there tonight, get a proper meal, and tomorrow we will work on finding you a more permanent solution. I give you my word as a gentleman that you will be safe under my roof." The relief that flooded Florence's face told Samuel he had made the right choice, even if it would complicate his life. She followed him across the yard to the ranch house, a modest structure with 2 bedrooms, a main living area with a fireplace, and a kitchen that Samuel had built with his own hands when he first claimed this land 6 years ago. Inside, Samuel lit several lamps and stirred the embers in the fireplace back to life while Florence stood uncertainly by the door. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the rough-hewn table and chairs. "I have some stew left from supper. It is not fancy, but it is hot and filling." As he reheated the stew over the fire, Samuel found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Florence sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight despite her obvious exhaustion. She had the bearing of someone who had been raised with certain standards and expectations, which made her current situation all the more tragic. "Here," Samuel said, placing a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread in front of her. "Eat slowly. If you have not eaten properly in a few days, you do not want to make yourself sick." Florence's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. Your kindness means more than you know." Samuel fixed himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, watching as she ate with careful, deliberate bites, clearly fighting the urge to devour the food despite her hunger. He found himself admiring her composure under such difficult circumstances. "Tell me about Missouri," Samuel said, partly to make conversation and partly because he was genuinely curious about this woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in his life. Florence swallowed a bite of bread before answering. "I grew up in St. Louis. My father owned a successful mercantile business. He died 2 years ago and my mother passed just 6 months later. I have no siblings, no other family to speak of. I met Robert when he came through St. Louis on business. He was charming, attentive, and spoke beautifully about New Mexico territory and his life here. When he proposed, it seemed like an answer to my loneliness. I sold my father's business, settled my parents' debts, and bought passage west with what remained." "That must have taken considerable courage," Samuel observed, "coming all this way to marry someone." "Or considerable foolishness," Florence said with a sad smile. "I should have been more cautious. But I was grieving and lonely, and Robert's letters painted such a vivid picture of the life we would build together. I wanted to believe in something hopeful." Samuel understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. He had come west himself 8 years ago, fleeing his own demons and seeking a fresh start. The West had a way of attracting people who needed to reinvent themselves. "What will you do now?" he asked. Florence set down her spoon, her expression troubled. "I honestly do not know. I have maybe $10 to my name. Not enough to return east and nowhere to return to even if I could afford the journey. I need to find employment, but as I said, no one in Abiquiu seems willing to hire me." "What kind of work can you do?" "I can read and write, do arithmetic and bookkeeping. I helped my father with his business records for years. I can sew, cook, and keep a household. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Lancaster, despite my current appearance." Samuel sipped his coffee, an idea forming in his mind. "As it happens, I could use some help around here. My bookkeeping is a mess. I have been meaning to mend clothes for months, and my cooking skills are limited to basics. If you are willing to work in exchange for room and board, at least until you save enough to establish yourself properly. I would be glad for the assistance." Florence stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Lancaster, I could not ask you to do that. The scandal alone would be substantial. A single woman living on your ranch, your reputation would be ruined." "My reputation can weather it," Samuel said, though he knew she was right about the talk it would cause. "Besides, we are 3 miles from town. It is not as if people will be watching my front door constantly. You need help and I need help. It seems like a practical arrangement." "Why would you do this for a complete stranger?" Florence asked, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel considered his answer carefully. "Because someone helped me once when I had nowhere else to go. Because turning you out would be wrong. And because, despite what happened with that Robert Coleman fellow, I believe there are still people in this world who try to do right by each other." Florence wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will get some rest, and we can discuss the details in the morning. You look exhausted." Samuel showed her to the spare room, which was small but clean, with a simple bed and a washstand. He fetched her a basin of water and a clean towel, then bid her good night and retired to his own room, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. The next morning, Samuel woke before dawn as usual and was surprised to find Florence already up, stoking the fire and examining the contents of his kitchen with a critical eye. Her hair was neatly braided, and though her dress was still the worse for wear, she had clearly done her best to make herself presentable. "Good morning," she said when she heard him enter. "I hope you do not mind. I could not sleep much, and I thought I might as well make myself useful. Your pantry is surprisingly well stocked for a bachelor." "I may not be a great cook, but I know enough to keep supplies on hand," Samuel said, unable to suppress a smile at her take-charge attitude. "Did you sleep at all?" "A few hours. More than I have gotten in days." "Mr. Lancaster, I have been thinking about your offer, and if you are truly willing, I would be grateful to accept the arrangement. But we should establish some ground rules to protect both our reputations as much as possible." Samuel poured himself coffee from the pot she had already prepared and found it considerably better than his usual brew. "What did you have in mind?" "I will handle the cooking, cleaning, mending, and bookkeeping as you suggested. In exchange, you provide room and board. But we should also establish a small wage, even if it is modest. That way, I am clearly an employee, not a charity case or something more scandalous. It makes the arrangement more proper." "That sounds fair. How about $10 a month to start?" Florence's eyes widened. "That is more than generous. It is less than I would pay a ranch hand, and you will be doing work that would otherwise take me considerable time and effort. Now, how about we have some breakfast, and then I will show you around the property." Over the next several days, Samuel watched with growing admiration as Florence transformed his household. She organized his chaotic kitchen, mended the pile of shirts and trousers he had been ignoring for months, and brought order to the ledgers where he tracked his cattle sales and expenses. She proved to be an excellent cook, creating flavorful meals from his basic supplies, and she had a quiet efficiency that Samuel found oddly comforting. For her part, Florence seemed to relax as the days passed, the haunted look in her eyes gradually fading as she settled into the routine of ranch life. Samuel noticed she was careful to maintain appropriate distance between them, always retiring to her room early in the evening and emerging only after she heard him moving about in the morning. She was protecting both their reputations, he realized, and he appreciated her discretion. On Sunday afternoon, about a week after Florence had arrived, Samuel drove them both into Abiquiu in his wagon to purchase additional supplies. He could see Florence's tension as they approached the town, her spine straightening and her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "People will talk," she said quietly. "Let them. Anyone who asks will get the truth. You work for me as a housekeeper and bookkeeper. There is nothing scandalous about that." But Samuel could feel the weight of curious stares as they made their way down the main street. Abiquiu was a small town with a mix of Hispanic families who had lived in the area for generations and newer Anglo settlers like himself. News traveled fast, and by now, everyone would have heard about Florence's unfortunate situation with Robert Coleman. At the general store, Samuel noticed how the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Gonzalez, looked at Florence with a mixture of pity and suspicion. As they selected their supplies, he overheard two women whispering near the fabric section, their eyes darting toward Florence. Shameful, really, living out there with him unchaperoned. What did she expect, coming all this way for a man who did not want her? Samuel felt his jaw clench, but before he could say anything, Florence placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Do not," she said softly. "It will only make things worse." They completed their purchases in silence, and Samuel was loading the supplies into the wagon when a well-dressed man approached. He was in his late 30s, with slicked hair and an expensive suit that marked him as prosperous by local standards. "Lancaster," the man said with a nod. Then his eyes moved to Florence with unconcealed interest. "And you must be Miss Davison. Robert Coleman mentioned your unfortunate situation. Terrible business, that." "Mr. Coleman mentioned me," Florence said, her voice carefully neutral. "Oh, yes. He feels quite badly about the misunderstanding. I am Henry Morrison, by the way. I own the largest cattle operation in the territory outside of Santa Fe." Samuel recognized the name. Morrison was known for his wealth and his influence, and also for his habit of acquiring things he wanted, regardless of the methods required. "Miss Davison is my employee now," Samuel said firmly. "She serves as my housekeeper and bookkeeper." Morrison's smile did not reach his eyes. "How practical. Miss Davison, if you ever find yourself in need of alternative employment, I am always looking for capable people. I could offer considerably more generous terms than a small rancher like Lancaster here." "Thank you, but I am quite satisfied with my current situation," Florence said, her tone polite but distant. Morrison tipped his hat, but Samuel did not miss the calculating look in his eyes before he walked away. As they drove back to the ranch, Florence seemed troubled. "What is it?" Samuel asked. "That man, Morrison, he gave me an uneasy feeling. Trust your instincts. Morrison has a reputation for getting what he wants, and he is not always particular about how he does it. Just stay clear of him." As autumn deepened into early winter, Samuel found his feelings for Florence growing more complex. She was unlike any woman he had known before, with her quiet strength and sharp intelligence. He enjoyed their conversations over dinner, the way she challenged his opinions on everything from politics to ranching practices, and the sound of her humming as she worked in the kitchen. One evening in mid-November, as they sat by the fire after supper, Florence looked up from the sock she was mending and said, "Tell me about your family, Samuel. You know my story, but I know very little of yours." It was the first time she had used his given name, and something about the intimacy of it made his heart quicken. "Not much to tell, really. I grew up in Texas, youngest of 3 boys. My father was a hard man, quick with his fists and his temper. My mother died when I was 12, and after that, home was not a place any of us wanted to be." "Is that why you came west?" "Partly. I left home at 16, worked as a ranch hand for various outfits. My middle brother, James, came with me. We saved our money and eventually bought this land together. We were going to build something worthwhile away from the past." "You said your brother died 3 years ago," Samuel nodded, the familiar ache settling in his chest. Fever took him. One day he was fine, the next he was burning up, and within a week he was gone. The doctors in Abiquiu could not do anything for him. After that, I ran the ranch alone. Did not see much point in having people around. Florence set down her mending and looked at him with such compassion that Samuel had to glance away. I am sorry, Samuel. Losing someone you love like that, it leaves a hole that never quite fills in. You understand, he said quietly. Your parents. Yes. For a long time after my mother died, I felt like I was just going through motions, waiting for something to give my life purpose again. That is partly why I was so willing to believe in Robert's promises. I wanted to believe there was something better waiting for me. And now. Florence smiled, and Samuel noticed how beautiful she looked in the firelight. Now I think perhaps I found something better than what Robert Coleman could have offered. This life here, it is simple but honest. No pretenses, no false promises, just hard work and the satisfaction of a day well spent. Over the following weeks, Samuel became increasingly aware of how much Florence's presence had changed his life. The house felt like a home rather than just a place to sleep. He looked forward to mealtimes and evenings by the fire, to her laughter when he told stories about his more disastrous attempts at cooking before she arrived, to the way she listened intently when he talked about his plans for expanding the herd. He tried to tell himself it was just gratitude, just appreciation for having help around the ranch, but he knew he was lying to himself. He was falling in love with Florence Davison, and that realization terrified him. The weather turned cold in December, with occasional snow dusting the landscape. Samuel taught Florence to ride so she could accompany him when he checked on the cattle in the far pastures. She proved to be a natural horsewoman, sitting tall in the saddle as they rode across his land, her cheeks pink from the cold and her eyes bright with enjoyment. One afternoon, they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek that ran through the property. Samuel had brought along some bread and cheese, and they sat on a flat rock, eating and watching the water flow past. "This land is beautiful," Florence said softly. "I never imagined the West would feel so peaceful." "You expected more gunfights and saloon brawls," Samuel teased. "Perhaps a few," she admitted with a laugh. "The stories back east paint quite a dramatic picture, but this quietness, this sense of space, it is different than I expected." Samuel watched her profile as she gazed out over the landscape, and before he could stop himself, he said, "Florence, I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her expression curious. "What is it?" But Samuel's courage failed him. What right did he have to burden her with his feelings? She had come here seeking security and stability, not another romantic entanglement that might end badly. "Just that I am glad you stayed," he said finally. "You have made this place feel alive again." Florence's eyes softened. "I am glad I stayed too, Samuel. More than you know." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken, and Samuel found himself leaning closer, drawn by the warmth in her gaze. But before anything could happen, a distant sound made him pull back. Riders approaching. Samuel stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "Stay here," he said to Florence. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line, and Samuel recognized them as hands from Henry Morrison's ranch. The lead rider, a rough-looking man named Garrett, raised his hand in greeting. "Lancaster," Garrett called out. "Mr. Morrison sent us to deliver a message." "What kind of message?" Samuel asked, not relaxing his guard. "He wants to make you an offer for your land. A generous offer. Says you should come to his ranch tomorrow to discuss terms. My land is not for sale." Garrett's smile was unpleasant. "Mr. Morrison figured you might say that. He wanted me to mention that he controls most of the water rights in this area." Would be a shame if your cattle suddenly found themselves short of water come summer." It was a thinly veiled threat, and Samuel felt his temper rise. "You tell Morrison that I am not interested in his offer, and if he tries to interfere with my water access, he will find himself dealing with more trouble than he bargained for." The three riders exchanged looks, and Garrett shrugged. "Suit yourself, Lancaster, but Mr. Morrison usually gets what he wants, one way or another. Be a shame if that pretty housekeeper of yours got caught in the middle of something unpleasant." Samuel took a step forward, his hand on his gun. "That sounded an awful lot like a threat, Garrett." "Just friendly advice," Garrett said, but his tone suggested otherwise. The three men turned their horses and rode off, leaving Samuel seething with anger. Florence had moved to stand beside him, her face pale. "Samuel, what was that about? Morrison wants my land." "This is prime grazing territory, and it has good water access. I bought it fair and square 6 years ago, but apparently he has decided he wants it for himself." "What will you do?" "Nothing. This is my land and I am not selling. Morrison can bluster all he wants, but he has no legal claim here." But over the following days, Samuel began to notice troubling signs. Fences were cut, allowing some of his cattle to wander onto neighboring property. His water trough was contaminated with something that made several of his horses sick. Nothing overtly violent, but a clear pattern of harassment designed to make his life difficult. Florence worried constantly, and Samuel hated seeing the fear return to her eyes. One evening, as they were finishing supper, she said, "Samuel, perhaps you should consider Morrison's offer. If he is willing to pay a fair price, you could start over somewhere else. It is not worth risking your safety or worse." "I am not running from a bully," Samuel said firmly. "Besides, where would I go? This is my home. James and I built this ranch with our own hands. I am not going to let Morrison take it just because he thinks he can intimidate me." "But what if it gets worse? What if someone gets hurt?" Samuel reached across the table and took her hand, the touch sending a jolt through him. "I am not going to let anything happen to you, Florence. I promise." Her fingers tightened around his. "It is not just me I am worried about." The vulnerability in her voice made Samuel's heart ache. He stood and moved around the table, pulling her up to face him. "Florence, I need to say something that I probably should have said weeks ago. These past few months with you here, they have been the happiest I have known in years. You have brought light into my life in ways I did not think possible. I know the circumstances that brought you here were difficult, and I know you probably are not looking for another romantic entanglement after what happened with Coleman. But I cannot keep pretending that my feelings for you are just those of an employer. I have fallen in love with you." Florence's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "Samuel, you do not have to say anything," Samuel continued quickly. "I just needed you to know. Whatever happens with Morrison, whatever you decide to do with your life, I wanted you to know that you are loved, truly and completely." For a long moment, Florence simply stared at him, and Samuel braced himself for rejection. But then she lifted her hand to his face, her touch gentle against his jaw. "You foolish man," she said softly. "Did you really think I was just staying here for the employment? I have been in love with you since that first week, when you taught me to ride and you were so patient with my mistakes. When you shared your stories about James, and I saw the depth of your capacity to love and grieve. When I watched you work with the horses and saw how gentle you could be despite your strength, I was terrified to say anything because I thought you might still see me as that desperate woman you found in your barn." Samuel felt as if the weight he had been carrying for weeks had suddenly lifted. "You love me." "With all my heart," Florence confirmed, and then she was in his arms and he was kissing her with all the pent-up longing of the past months. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his hair as they held each other close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Florence, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "Yes," Florence whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other and marveling at this unexpected turn their lives had taken. But their happiness was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass as a rock crashed through the front window, landing on the floor amid shattered shards. Samuel pushed Florence behind him and grabbed his rifle from above the door. Outside, he could hear the sound of riders galloping away, their laughter echoing in the night. Attached to the rock was a note written in crude letters. "Last chance. Sell or face the consequences." Florence picked up the note with trembling hands. "Samuel, this has gone too far. We need to get help." "Who is going to help us?" "The sheriff is in Morrison's pocket. Most of the other ranchers are afraid to cross him. We are on our own in this." But Florence shook her head firmly. "No, we are not. Tomorrow we are going into town, and we are going to stand up to this man properly. If the sheriff will not help, we will go over his head. We will send word to the territorial governor if we have to. Morrison cannot be allowed to terrorize people like this." Samuel admired her courage even as he worried about the danger. "Florence, these are ruthless men. I do not want you caught in the crossfire." "I am already in the crossfire, Samuel, and I am not about to let some greedy cattle baron ruin the life we are trying to build. Tomorrow we fight back, but we do it smart. We document everything that has happened, we gather any evidence we can, and we make sure the right people know what Morrison is doing." She was right, Samuel realized. Running or giving in were not the only options. They could fight back using the law, even if it took time. The next morning, Samuel and Florence rode into Abiquiu together. Their first stop was at the telegraph office, where Florence composed a detailed message to the territorial authorities in Santa Fe, outlining Morrison's harassment and requesting an investigation. She had a gift for clear, compelling writing, and her account laid out the facts without emotional embellishment. Next, they visited the newspaper office. The editor, a man named Thomas Winters, listened to their story with growing interest. "I have heard rumors about Morrison's tactics," Winters said, "but no one has been willing to go on record before. If you are willing to tell your story publicly, I will print it." "We are willing," Samuel said firmly, his hand finding Florence's. Over the next hour they recounted everything that had happened, and Winters took copious notes. When they finished, he sat back and whistled low. "This is going to cause quite a stir. Morrison is not going to be happy." "Good," Florence said with surprising fierceness. "Men like him rely on people being too afraid to speak up. It is time someone did." The article ran in the next edition of the Abiquiu Herald, and the response was immediate. Several other ranchers came forward with their own stories of intimidation and harassment by Morrison and his men. The territorial authorities in Santa Fe took notice, and within 2 weeks, an investigator arrived to look into the allegations. During this time, Samuel and Florence remained vigilant. They took turns keeping watch at night, and Samuel taught Florence to shoot, wanting her to be able to defend herself if necessary. But Morrison seemed to have pulled back, perhaps realizing that continued harassment would only strengthen the case against him. In late January, the investigator concluded his work and departed for Santa Fe to file his report. He told Samuel privately that he had found sufficient evidence of illegal activity to warrant formal charges against Morrison for intimidation, property destruction, and attempted extortion. "It will take time to work through the legal system," the investigator warned. "But Morrison's days of terrorizing this territory are numbered. You did a brave thing speaking up." Samuel and Florence celebrated quietly that evening, relieved that the worst seemed to be over. As they sat by the fire, Samuel pulled out the ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small chip of turquoise. "It is not much," he said, offering it to Florence, "but I would be honored if you would wear it." Florence's eyes filled with tears as she held out her hand, allowing him to slide the ring onto her finger. "It is perfect. Everything about this is perfect." They were married in February by the circuit preacher who passed through Abiquiu monthly. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with just a handful of witnesses. But Samuel had never felt happier than when Florence spoke her vows, promising to stand by his side through whatever life brought them. The townspeople's attitude toward them had shifted considerably since they had stood up to Morrison. Florence was no longer viewed with suspicion but with respect, and several of the ranch wives who had previously shunned her now made a point of welcoming her into their social circles. Morrison himself was arrested in March and taken to Santa Fe to stand trial. The charges against him were serious enough that he faced significant prison time if convicted. His cattle empire began to crumble as creditors and partners distanced themselves from the scandal. With the threat of Morrison removed, Samuel and Florence could finally focus on building their life together. Spring brought new calves, and the work of branding and managing the growing herd. Florence proved to be a capable partner in every aspect of ranch life, equally comfortable with account books and riding out to check on cattle. In late summer, Florence came to Samuel one evening with news that made his heart soar. She was pregnant. They held each other in the fading light, overwhelmed with joy and gratitude for how far they had come from that October night when she had whispered she had nowhere else to go. Their son was born the following April, a healthy baby boy with Samuel's dark hair and Florence's keen eyes. They named him James, after Samuel's brother, and Samuel felt as if the circle of loss that had defined so much of his life had finally been closed with new life and new hope. As young James grew, the ranch prospered. Samuel gradually expanded his herd, and Florence's skilled bookkeeping ensured they made sound financial decisions. They hired a few ranch hands to help with the increased workload, and the Lancaster Ranch became known as one of the most well-run operations in the territory. 2 years after James was born, Florence gave birth to twin girls, Lucy and Alina, who kept their parents busy and filled the house with laughter and chaos. Samuel built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, and he often found himself pausing in his work to marvel at the fullness of his life. On a spring evening in 1885, nearly 7 years after Florence had first appeared in his barn, Samuel stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Florence came out to join him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About that night I found you in the barn," Samuel said. "How I had no idea that my entire life was about to change, how close I came to just sending you away." Florence leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think about that night too. I was so frightened, so desperate. I had no idea that the man holding that lantern would become my whole world." From inside the house, they heard James calling for his mother, and the twins were giggling about something. The sounds of their family, safe and loved, filled Samuel with a contentment he had never thought possible. "We should go in," Florence said. "The children will be wanting their bedtime story." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "In a minute. Let me just hold you here for a moment longer." They stood together as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Samuel thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. all the pain and loss and fear that had eventually led to something beautiful. He thought about second chances and the courage it took to open your heart when life had given you every reason to keep it closed. "I love you," he said to Florence, words he never tired of saying. "I love you too," she replied, "always and forever." Inside, their children were waiting, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. But for this moment, standing on the porch of the home they had built together, Samuel and Florence Lancaster had everything they needed: each other, their family, and the promise of all the days still to come. The years continued to unfold with the rhythm of ranch life. James grew into a thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the horses, showing a natural talent for working with animals. The twins developed distinct personalities. Lucy was bold and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring, while Alina was quieter, preferring to help her mother in the garden and with cooking. In 1887, Florence gave birth to another son, whom they named Thomas after her father. The boy had his mother's sharp intelligence and his father's steady temperament, and Samuel delighted in watching his children grow and thrive. The ranch continued to prosper under their stewardship. Samuel's reputation as an honest rancher who treated his workers fairly meant he had no shortage of capable hands willing to work for him. Florence's business acumen ensured they weathered the various economic fluctuations that affected the cattle industry, saving during good years to sustain them through leaner times. Morrison, they learned through periodic news reports, had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His former empire had been divided among various creditors and purchasers, with no one person controlling enough to pose the kind of threat he had represented. The other ranchers in the area breathed easier, and a spirit of cooperation rather than competition began to characterize their relationships. Samuel and Florence became pillars of the Abiquiu community. Florence started a lending library in town, using books she ordered from back east, and she gave reading lessons to children whose parents could not afford formal schooling. Samuel served on the Territorial Cattlemen's Association and worked to establish fair practices and regulations that protected smaller ranchers from being squeezed out by larger operations. Their home became known for its hospitality. Florence loved having people over for Sunday dinners, and their table often hosted neighbors, traveling preachers, and occasionally someone down on their luck who needed a meal and a kind word. She never forgot what it felt like to have nowhere to go, and she made it her mission to ensure no one in their community felt that desperation if she could help it. One autumn evening in 1890, as they celebrated their older children's birthdays with cake and presents, Samuel found himself reflecting on the passage of time. James was nearly 11 now, tall and lanky, already showing signs of the man he would become. The twins were 9, full of energy and mischief, and young Thomas was 3, toddling around and getting into everything. After the children were in bed, Samuel and Florence sat on their porch as they often did, watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Florence asked. "If Robert Coleman had actually married me as he promised." Samuel considered the question. "I try not to think about it, honestly. The thought of you married to someone else, it still makes my chest tight even though I know it is foolish." Florence laughed softly. "It is not foolish, but I think about it sometimes, and I am grateful it happened the way it did. Robert would have given me security, perhaps, but not this. Not love and partnership and a family built on real understanding. His betrayal, as painful as it was, led me exactly where I needed to be." "I am grateful too," Samuel said, "for every twist of fate that brought you to my barn that night. for your courage in trusting a stranger, for choosing to stay. I did not really have much choice at the time, Florence reminded him with a smile. But you did. You could have moved on once you had some money saved. You could have gone back east or tried another town, but you stayed and built this life with me. Florence reached for his hand. Because I saw something in you that first night, Samuel, kindness and integrity. And then I got to know you better and found so much more, strength and humor and loyalty. You gave me a home when I had none, but more than that, you gave me a reason to believe in love again, in people again. That is worth more than all the security in the world. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees Samuel had planted when James was born. I want to expand the northern pasture next spring, Samuel said eventually, his mind turning to practical matters as it often did. The herd has grown enough that we could use the additional grazing land. We can afford it, Florence confirmed. She kept meticulous records and always knew their exact financial position. But we should also think about setting aside more for the children's education. James will be ready for more advanced schooling in a few years, and the girls are not far behind. You are thinking about sending them away? Samuel asked, trying to keep the concern from his voice. Not permanently, no, but perhaps to Santa Fe for a year or two when they are old enough. I want them to have opportunities, Samuel, to see more of the world than just this ranch as much as we love it. Samuel understood her reasoning even as the thought of his children leaving, even temporarily, pained him. We will do what is best for them. That is what parents are supposed to do, even when it is hard. The conversation shifted to other topics. The new foal that had been born that week, the upcoming harvest social in town, repairs needed on the barn roof before winter. These were the mundane details of their life, but Samuel found deep satisfaction in discussing them with Florence, in the way they made decisions together and supported each other's ideas. As the years passed, their children grew and their characters solidified. James proved to be a natural rancher, with his father's patience and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 16, he was managing significant portions of the ranch operation and showing leadership qualities that made Samuel proud. The twins remained close despite their different temperaments. Lucy talked about wanting to see the ocean someday, to travel and experience life beyond New Mexico territory. Alina showed artistic talent, sketching the landscape and people around her with remarkable skill. Thomas developed a love of books and learning that reminded Samuel of his mother, often found reading when he should have been doing chores. In 1895, Florence gave birth to their last child, another girl they named Margaret. By then, Florence was 40 years old and Samuel was 47, and they both felt this child was a final, precious gift. Little Margaret was doted on by her older siblings, who took turns helping care for her and entertaining her. The same year Margaret was born, New Mexico territory saw significant changes. The railroad expanded its reach, bringing new settlers and new opportunities. Abiquiu grew from a small town into a more substantial community with new businesses and amenities. Samuel and Florence watched these changes with mixed feelings, appreciating the progress while sometimes missing the simpler days of their early years together. Samuel's hair had begun to gray at the temples, and Florence noticed fine lines around her eyes when she looked in the mirror, but neither of them minded these signs of aging. They had earned every gray hair and every wrinkle through years of hard work, laughter, tears, and love. One evening in the spring of 1898, Samuel came in from working with the horses to find Florence sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face as she read a letter. Alarmed, he rushed to her side. "What is it? What is wrong?" Florence looked up at him with a trembling smile. "Nothing is wrong. These are happy tears, I promise. This letter, it is from a lawyer in St. Louis. Apparently, a distant cousin of my father's passed away and he left me a small inheritance. Not a fortune, but enough to make a real difference." Samuel read the letter over her shoulder. The amount was indeed substantial, enough to secure their children's education and then some. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. Florence wiped her eyes and thought for a moment. "I want to use some of it for the children's schooling, as we discussed. But I also want to donate some to build a proper school here in Abiquiu. And perhaps we could finally take that trip we have talked about, just the two of us. We have been running this ranch for 20 years without a real break." Samuel felt a surge of excitement at the thought of traveling with Florence, of having time together away from the constant demands of ranch life. "Where would you want to go?" "I have always wanted to see the California coast," Florence said, "to stand on the beach and watch the Pacific Ocean." "Would you take me there, Samuel?" "I would take you anywhere," Samuel replied, pulling her into his arms. "To the ends of the earth if you asked." They planned their trip for late summer, after the busiest season of ranch work was complete. James, now 20 years old and fully capable, would manage the ranch in their absence with help from their most trusted hands. The younger children would stay with Florence's friend, Martha Henderson, who had long since forgiven any awkwardness about Florence's initial arrival in Abiquiu and had become one of her closest friends. In August, Samuel and Florence boarded a train heading west, an adventure unlike any they had undertaken in their years together. They held hands like young courting couples as they watched the landscape change from the familiar deserts and mesas of New Mexico to the mountains of Arizona and California, finally reaching the coast. Standing on the beach in San Francisco, watching waves crash against the shore, Florence turned to Samuel with pure joy on her face. "It is even more beautiful than I imagined." Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I am glad I get to see it with you." They spent 2 weeks exploring the California coast, staying in hotels, eating in restaurants, and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company without the responsibilities of ranch and family pressing on them. They talked about everything and nothing, reminisced about their years together, and made love with the same passion they had felt as newlyweds. On their last evening before returning home, they walked along the beach at sunset, and Samuel said, "Thank you for this. For pushing us to take this time together. I did not realize how much I needed it until now. We have been so focused on building our life and raising our children, sometimes we forget to just be with each other," Florence said. "But I do not regret a moment of it. Every challenge, every triumph, every ordinary day, I would not trade any of it." "Neither would I," Samuel agreed, "though I am ready to go home now, ready to see our children and sleep in our own bed and wake up to the view from our porch." Florence laughed. "Yes, I am ready too. As wonderful as this has been, home is where my heart is." They returned to Abiquiu in early September to find everything running smoothly. James had handled several minor crises with maturity and good judgment, proving he was ready for increasing responsibility. The other children were full of stories about their time with Martha, and baby Margaret had learned to say several new words in their absence. Life settled back into its familiar patterns, but something had shifted. Samuel and Florence made a point of carving out time for each other, taking evening rides together, having long conversations after the children were in bed, remembering that they were partners first, before they were parents or ranchers or community members. The turn of the century arrived with celebrations throughout the territory. Samuel and Florence hosted a large party at their ranch, inviting neighbors and friends to mark the occasion. As midnight approached, Samuel gathered his family around him, looking at the faces of his children, his wife, and feeling overwhelming gratitude. 22 years ago, he said to the assembled crowd, I found this woman hiding in my barn. She told me she had nowhere else to go, and I made a decision that changed my life forever. I invited her into my home, never imagining that she would become my home, that we would build all of this together. Florence's eyes glistened with tears as Samuel continued. So as we step into this new century, I want to say thank you to my wife for choosing me, for building this life with me, for giving me a family and a purpose beyond anything I could have dreamed. And I want to tell my children that the greatest legacy your mother and I can leave you is the example of how to love completely, work honestly, and face challenges with courage. May you all find in your own lives the kind of partnership and joy that we have found together. The crowd cheered and toasted as the clock struck midnight, and Samuel kissed Florence while their children cheered and made exaggerated sounds of disgust at their parents' display of affection. The early years of the new century brought both joys and sorrows. In 1902, James married a local girl named Sarah Mitchell, a kind young woman who fit seamlessly into the Lancaster family. Samuel and Florence gained their first grandchild, a boy named William, in 1903, and Samuel felt his heart expand in ways he had not expected when he held his grandson for the first time. Lucy, true to her adventurous spirit, left for Santa Fe to work as a journalist, writing articles about life in the territory. She sent regular letters home filled with her observations and experiences, and Florence read them aloud to the family with pride. Eleanor stayed closer to home, using her artistic talents to document life in rural New Mexico through her sketches and paintings. Her work began to gain recognition, with pieces displayed in galleries in Santa Fe and even Denver. Thomas eventually attended university in California, studying to become a doctor, driven by a desire to help people in rural areas who often lacked access to medical care. Margaret, the youngest, was still at home, bright and curious, following her mother around and learning everything she could about running a household and managing accounts. In 1908, Samuel celebrated his 60th birthday surrounded by 3 generations of family. Looking around at the crowded house, at the grandchildren playing, at his grown children laughing together, at Florence directing the chaos with her usual grace, he felt a profound sense of completion. Later that evening, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Samuel and Florence walked out to the barn where it had all begun. Samuel lit a lantern, just as he had done 30 years ago, and held it up, casting the same golden glow over the interior. "You remember?" he asked Florence. "Every detail," she replied. "I was terrified and desperate and trying so hard to be brave. And then you appeared, this tall cowboy with kind eyes, and I did not know if I should be more or less afraid. I remember thinking you looked like some kind of wild creature, all big eyes and trembling fear. I just wanted to help, but I had no idea what I was getting into." Florence laughed and took the lantern from him, setting it on the same post where he had placed it that night. "We have built a good life, have we not, from such an unlikely beginning?" "The best life," Samuel confirmed. "And if I had it to do over, I would not change a single thing." They stood together in the barn, holding each other, the weight of years and love and shared history binding them as securely as any rope. Outside, the New Mexico night was vast and star-filled, the same sky that had watched over them through all their years together. "I love you, Florence Lancaster," Samuel said, "from that first night until my last breath. And I love you, Samuel Lancaster. Thank you for giving me somewhere to go. Thank you for giving me a home." They walked back to the house hand in hand, their shadows stretching long in the lamplight. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The future stretched before them, however many years they had left, and they would face it as they had faced everything else, together. As Samuel blew out the lamps and settled into bed beside his wife, listening to her breathing slow, and even as she fell asleep, he thought about the strange twists of fate that shape human lives. How a woman's misfortune had become his greatest blessing. How a moment of compassion had transformed into a lifetime of love. He closed his eyes, his hand finding Florence's in the darkness, and slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it side by side, just as they always had. Their story had begun with desperation and uncertainty, with a whispered plea in a dark barn. But it had become something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and love to transform even the darkest moments into light. And that light would continue to shine through their children and grandchildren, through the life they had built on this small patch of New Mexico land, long after they themselves had passed into memory. This was their legacy, not just the ranch or the family name, but the proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that home is not a place you find but something you build, one day at a time, with the person you love.